Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and introduce two extraordinary men. Charles Kochman is the editor-director of Abrams Comic Arts. Kochman has edited several hundred books for people of all ages, including picture books, retrospectives, definitive monologues, and award-winning graphic novels by Harvey Pekar, Dirk Bechters, and collections with Harry Bliss, George Booth, Robert Crumb, Al Jaffe, Françoise Mouly, Art Spiegleman, and the Topps Company. Kochman is also the editor of the #1 selling series, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, by Jeff Kinney. Previously, Kochman spent 12 years as editor in DC Comics' licensed publishing department. Kochman is a member of the National Cartoonist Society and the Society of Illustrators, and is on the board of advisors for the San Diego Comics Con Bill Finger Award of Excellence in Comic Book Writing and the Spectrum Art Annual and the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art. Please help me in welcoming Charles Kochman.
Thank you.
And now I introduce Art Spiegleman. Art Spiegleman single-handedly brought comic books out of the toy closet and onto the literature shelves. In 1992, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his masterful Holocaust narrative, Mouse, which portrayed Jews as mice and the Nazis as cats. Mouse, too, continued the remarkable story of his parents' survival of the Nazi regime and later their lives in America. Spiegelman has won numerous prestigious awards for his work and has published many graphic novels and comics. Cy Lewen's Parade, an Artist Odyssey, published by Abrams Comic Arts, is a timeless story in a language that knows no country. A wordless epic that, despite its muteness, is more powerful than the written and spoken word. First published in 1957, The Parade is a lost classic, newly discovered, remastered, and presented by Art Spiegelman. The Parade is a celebration of art and the story of a recurring war Cy Lewen experienced over the past 90 years. Watching the joyful parades that marched to end the World War I led into the death marches of World War II and the Korean War. As the parade unfolds, the reader is taken through an unforgettable journey of sequential images. I welcome Art Spiegelman.
Cool. Thank you so much for coming. This book is about a collaboration between Art Spiegelman and an artist named Cy Lewen. And we're going to sort of give you a little bit of an overview of who Cy Lewen was and what the parade is. And I thought we'll start with a little bit of a very, very brief overview of Art Spiegelman's career, and we'll go from there. That's pretty much.
You got me right before the last panel.
But that sums it up. But Art's more than that, obviously. He's known for being the author and illustrator of the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel Mouse. Some consider him the father of the graphic novel. I think you're in dispute on that?
Yeah, I'm still asking for a paternity test, actually. It's what led to this book, even.
Part of Art's, responsibility is working with his wife, Françoise Mouly, who's the cover editor of The New Yorker. They edited a series called Raw Magazine. It's just a brief overview of some Raw issues of Raw. And then while Art and Françoise collaborated on a series of really quite stellar and important covers for The New Yorker. And without getting into too many details, and if you want to stop on any particular one, let me know. But these are just some highlights of Art's.
Well, actually, maybe that first one. Sorry to make you go back.
Sure.
Because that's the one that changed the DNA of The New Yorker to allow Françoise to do what she's doing now, which is to make covers that really are echoing the zeitgeist and the political and social situation on a weekly basis, so that these are like images that allow one to understand where one is as we hurtle through time. This was the first time in a long time that The New Yorker, back in February 1990, 93, that the covers weren't bucolic country scenes and post-impressionist pastiches of a quiet place on the newsstand, which is what the New Yorker had intended to be. At the time I did this picture, it was right after the Crown Heights riots. The Orthodox Jews in the West Indian African-American community had come to race riot blows, and it was Valentine's Day, and I'd just been invited to make covers for the New Yorker, and I was just doodling, trying to figure out what Eustace Tilley, that man with a monocle, would look like if he was Orthodox. And I tell you, before the internet, you couldn't make more of a ruckus than this cover made. I was actually here in Miami when it came out. There was a show of my Mao's drawings here, and the next day we were going home. It was me and Francoise and our two kids. We had lots of suitcases. We were being hustled back to New York to do interviews about this thing, and we were surrounded by a hostile press at the airport, and it's as if they had found us trying to escape to Cuba. And I had to begin answering questions about this. And what was funny to me was that everybody was outraged simultaneously. The Jewish Orthodox community was mad at me because, A, I'm a maker of graven images in general, but here very specifically, don't you know that an Orthodox Jew can't even touch his wife in public? And I said, it's not in public, it's red. And then I said, who's to say that they're not married? You know, she's Sephardic, that's all. And that didn't work. I was stuck with being a maker of graven images. The African-American community had a minister on the radio the next day complaining about how one more time the white man is exploiting the black woman. If the artist had any guts, he would have made a black man kissing a Jewish lady. And I explained to him, because I was called to respond to this on the radio show, saying, well, you might be a good reverend pastor, but you know, you're a terrible art director. Nobody would recognize a woman with a handkerchief on her head as automatically Jewish, and you'd be here screaming about the black man being portrayed one more time as a predator on white women. So it's the situation that's hot, not the picture. And they're not exploiting anybody. Their arms are around each other. Anyway, after all this, and people really squawking, like there's an op-ed piece that complained about everything about this cover, including the Jews' lascivious lips. And then a rabbi in the Washington Post on the same day as that Times thing describing it as prim lips. And I can't do them both ways, prim and lascivious. And then we got this great letter that taught me that all these images to a degree are Rorschach tests. The letter comes to the magazine saying she thought it was really sweet that here on Abraham Lincoln's birthday there's a picture of him kissing a slave. Voila. All right, so I thought that one was worth sharing.
No, I think so. This is just a handful more, just each one controversial when they came out for different reasons. That's your famous Bill Clinton cover.
Yeah, that was called The Low Road. And that was called Brief Encounter.
And I think your most poetic and beautiful was one that this came out after 9/11. You could see it better here. I thought this was very iconic, and it was sort of, as you said, a cover that sort of helped us heal.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't know about healing. We were freaked out, Francoise and I. This is a collaborative image, ultimately. And what it was just trying to make sense of what was going on around us. And there was murmurings about maybe we just had to have a photograph on the cover. And Francoise definitely didn't want to see that happen, where this is one of the few magazines that allows an artist to make an image, and the image to sometimes relate to the content inside, sometimes not, but to have a statement. And rather than a photo of burning buildings, this filled the bill, because we lived just a little bit north of the tower, and I would then have I had a studio a bit 2 blocks, 3 blocks further north, and every time I'd walk from home, seeing the kids, and then over to the studio, on that day or two, I'd look back over my shoulder to make sure that the towers were still missing. So this black on black image that you could only see the towers in certain reflective light with 2 different inks and whatever, allowed one to have that phantom limb syndrome expressed of the missing towers.
And that later became a book called In the Shadow of No Towers.
Yes, that's when Spiegleman went off the deep end. He couldn't get off it. Like September 12th for me didn't come for about a year or so after, and I got furious about how our government had hijacked this criminal event and turned it into a recruiting poster for a war in Iraq. So the book veered from my personal experiences to the mudslide that the country went into, which was only a prelude to the mudslide we're all drowning in now.
Yeah.
That's right.
So a handful of other books that Art's done in his career. He did this Little Lit series, children's book called Open Me, I'm a Dog. This is an anthology that Art and I collaborated on, that Abrams published, collecting classic children's comics. Art sort of totally formed my youth by creating a series called Wacky Packages. This is a book that we published collecting the best images, which were these sort of parodies of actual products, and these were stickers that you would stick all over your bedroom.
See, I was an underground comics artist, and I was making my living working for a bubblegum sticker company called Topps, and I was just regurgitating the lessons I had learned from MAD, and I realized that although I was mostly working for underground newspapers, this was still part of the counterculture. It was just the candy counter. And this plus another, the next series that became a very big deal, I'd been there for about 20 years, was Garbage Pail Kids. I did these in the height of the Cabbage Patch Kid controversy, with a group of artists, very talented artists and writers, working as the art director, editor, and a writer for this surprisingly successful series. And here, I was working anonymously, as were all the artists involved, and my publisher of what eventually was Mouse was so relieved. He said, "You did Garbage Pail Kids? If we put out Mouse now, it's just going to get called Garbage Pail Mice and it's all over." So since Topps wanted me to be anonymous because they didn't want Fleers to hire me at $20 more a drawing, and my publisher wanted me to be anonymous, people are now surprised to find that this was part of my trajectory. But like I said, it's all part of a candy counter culture.
This one seemed particularly apt right now.
Yeah, except the hand would be smaller.
Part of what Art has done, the comics are referred to as graphic novels, different things. Art likes to refer to the term as commixing of art and images. Comics have a long history of being, labeled not good for children, sort of, as you said, something that, we would need to protect kids from. There were, bonfires in the 50s, because comics led to juvenile delinquency, and this was a way of, people purging their comics. But I'd be curious for you in terms of, how in this next drawing, you...
Well, we lived through a sea change. This is a scientific chart showing the changing perception of adult comic book readers. When I was growing up, when these comic books were being put on bonfires, comic books were seen as lower than anything except maybe tattoo art. They were a variant of pornography. And if an adult was reading them, it was not a good way to kind of make your way socially in the world. But there in 1986, where the dotted line is, the world changed. All of a sudden, it was very cool to be a comics artist. It was comics were now being allowed into bookstores, into museums, into libraries, studied in universities, and the power of language. As soon as we changed the word, not me, I don't like the word, to not Garbage Pail Kids. What do they call them? Oh yeah, graphic novels. When they were changed to graphic novels, they had entree into the salon rather than being kept in the basement. And then I found out that cartoonists now felt like rock and roll stars, and they could even get dates, which was proof that language has a certain power as we changed the word.
And Art's done a lot, obviously, to bring this acceptance of comics as literature. That's just a very brief, sort of overlook of some of the things he's been doing. But I want to segue into Lewen and part of, and the new book. And part of what it is that you started doing this thing called Wordless. And if you want to talk a little bit about the evolution of Wordless and how it related to Sci.
Do I have to answer in 25 words or less? Because this is a little bit hard. There was a genre of book that started in about 1918 that was the wordless novel. It was stories told only in images. And I really always wanted to talk about this. I lecture about comics, but it's too big a subset of this genre to be enfolded into everything from Mutt and Jeff to Superman and Mad and beyond. And one day I got a call from the Sydney Opera House asking if I would go there and be interviewed. I said, really, Sydney? That's far. Like, I can be interviewed from my bed if we do it by phone. But wait, you have an opera house. Could I use it? They said, yes. I have a friend who's a jazz musician named Philip Johnston, and I thought of doing a project explaining these wordless novels finally. And what that entailed was showing bits and all of some of these books, genre that thrived till about 1938 or so, in order to talk about their implications and their importance, because these were, these wordless novels, the first real graphic novels. They were told in pictures, they were not for children, and they wrestled with very serious subjects mostly. And here, the only way to present them was to turn them back into the movies that inspired them. They were inspired by silent film as well as Japanese woodcuts. And I would say that I had to turn these things inspired by silent film back into some kind of moving image so I could take somebody through these stories and then talk about them and what the importance of taking language out of a book might be, a book of pictures, and still tell a story. And I suppose that's when I needed a live band with me, and that's how Philip, who was somebody who admired and loved silent film, composed new scores for old films, and just got a doctorate a few weeks ago in the history of silent film music in Australia, would take all these things and turn them into brief, musically accompanied silent stories, because the music could accelerate your understanding from image to image. We just got back from doing this in London at the Barbican. We did it a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago at BAM, and it's a hard thing to get up and running. It's multimedia lecture of some kind on this phenomenon, the wordless book.
So I want to make sure we get to Cy, and just briefly sort of overview. Franz Mazariel was one of the
he was the kind of the founder of the genre of this kind of picture book story, and what got other artists interested in exploring the form.
And traditionally they were one single image on the right-hand page. On the left was blank. Here's just again, a handful of these. And they were narrative stories. There's another artist, his name is Lynn Ward, who also a great practitioner of wordless books. Here's just a few samples. And then Art, you later collected for Library of America, the Lynn Ward.
Library of America, who usually does people like Mark Twain and Faulkner and Henry James, because of the phrase graphic novel, decided to unfold these picture stories by Lynn Ward, the first American to do this kind of this wordless picture story as a graphic novel. These are beautifully printed thing where I fronted as the editor and wrote a long essay, which led me to think of doing wordless as a project. And as I said, basically we were taking sausages and turning them back into pigs by making them into short films, but as a way to introduce people to these stories.
And while you were working on Wordless, you came across a book by a man named Cy Lewen called The Parade.
Exactly. We finally got to
Cy.
First sentence. Okay. What this was while researching Wordless, after having done the Lynn Ward book, I was, it's much easier in the age of the internet to research than to do work. I love it. So I found this very obscure version of a picture story done right after the war that, in a way, made the fullest use of the genre, because they weren't just melodramatic stories about the problems of the 30s, which had to do with the problems of today. Like you'll hear Bernie Sanders perhaps talking about this thing, a phenomena, the 99% and the 1%. Well, a lot of those books by Lynn Ward and others dealt with that. They dealt with the alienation of that period, but World War II was kind of a big deal. And as we are now sliding towards something bigger than World War II, perhaps, the mudslide of the Western world, seriously, I found this book, not done in woodcuts or engravings the way the other books were, but done as a series of dense touche, charcoal, and pencil drawings that could modulate from light to dark and tell a very specific kind of a story. It was telling the story of our relentless generational love affair with death and war. That basically it's a cycle of every generation gets a war fever that starts with parades and ends with carnage, and then the survivors huddle together shouting victory until the next generation comes along to repeat the same thing. And this was Cy's vision that was born of his life on the battlefield in World War II.
So we collected this in a book called The Parade. And The Parade is actually two books. On one side is a reprint of The Parade, which Art remastered and worked with Cy Lewen to insert outtakes. And it's done as an accordion fold. So that
Do you have a copy?
I do. So I wanted to show here.
We talked about doing something that I just wanted to see, which is, this format is rather unusual because it's what Cy always would have wanted, not the page of white on the left. Two volunteers. You see, what Cy wanted when he was a kid was he would go to museums with his parents in Germany. He was a Polish refugee from Lublin right after World War I. He was born right around Armistice Day. He would go to these museums with his parents, his father being a famous Yiddish writer, even though that's now an oxymoron, and his mother, who was the granddaughter of the wonder. Oh, that's what happens if you pull too hard. That's why we don't do this often. Don't try this at home with your copy. And what he would do, leave it be for now then. What you said you took a damaged book with you. There it is. Now, the thing was that Cy would be left to his own devices in these art museums, and he would dance around the paintings, chattering to them as a toddler. And then when he went out, his parents would talk to him about it. And he said, yes, I had a great time. I was talking to the paintings. The only sad thing is, when I go home, the paintings should sit closer together so they can talk to each other. This book's format is built on the notion of pictures that talk to each other, a parade that can be continual if you handle with care, or you can at least look at a few pictures at the same time. And can you actually turn it so we see the back for a second?
Well, we're going to, yeah.
Whatever's left of that, could you turn it so we see?
So on the other side of this, it's basically two books in one.
It starts again, and what you get is Cy Lewen's backstory on the back. My essay on my appreciation for him, what it was to know him, and about the kind of work he was doing, bits of his unpublished memoir, pictures from various points in his career, and giving you the full thing that I found out after being attracted to this book. And definitely here pictures talking to each other as well. It grew out of the fact that I looked at the blank backs of what all these accordion folds as they are would be, and my father never liked me to waste anything, so white paper for a book seemed like a sad use of the space perhaps. So we did this whole second book on the back to tell you more about this man I befriended after I found out he was still alive while working on Wordless, Cy Lewen.
So he was, when you first met him, he was 95. He's living in a...
93 or 4 when I first met him while I was doing Wordless. I'd called him first and said I wanted to use Parade in this project I was doing after I found out he was still alive, because he looked like, the one photo I'd found of him made him look like a mature man back when he did this book. And then I asked the place I'd gotten in touch with that represented him to some degree if I could use the pictures in this performance, and they said, you'll have to ask Cy. So I call up, and much to my surprise, Cy knew my work, and I said, can we do this? We pay a small honorarium. He said, art is not a commodity, it's priceless. Of course you can use it. I might not be alive next year to see it, but you could use it, but you can't pay for it because art is priceless. And then we talk a little more, and he says, you know, when something's priceless, it's weightless. And that's what happened to the art of Cy Lewen. It went from being very expensive in art galleries to him turning his back on the art world to say art is not a commodity. And he continued painting more prolifically than ever, but without a gallery with these paintings that had come to be worth, at the time in the 50s and early 60s, $10,000, $15,000 a piece, which made them be worth, in today's money, say $150,000 a canvas, to being eventually worthless. He was forgotten in his burgeoning career, and he was free to make the art he wanted rather than becoming a bullshit artist and painted what the gallery wanted from him.
So we want to show you, Art mentioned Wordless that he showed. This has got music by Philip Johnson, who he spoke about, and this is just a short film about the parade.
It's 5 minutes.
So, let's see if this works.
So, like I said, the new book is remastered from the original drawings, and more drawings were added in with size cooperation. And this story is obviously about the multi-generational war fever that leads to death, and doing it again and again and again. And I'm sorry to be polemical here, but the dogs of war are howling in our ears at this point. So this was said to us by, could you go 2 slides forward?
You want?
Not that. Oh, okay, sorry. There it is. Okay. Albert Einstein saw these as drawings in Lottie Jacobi's gallery. She was a photographer of experimental photographs and of portraits. Her friend Albert Einstein saw these drawings and wrote a fan letter to Cy saying, "Our world needs you." Can we do that?
When we had a little more time, I thought we were going to go through. We were a little bit rushed, but this is the letter from Albert Einstein. But the kicker.
Our time needs you and your work. So it doesn't take a genius to know it's still true, which is why, hence the book now. And what I found very moving about it is, obviously it moves through territory I've moved in before, and I haven't done much since, which is, my connection to the death camps and whatever. He lived through them as a special ops soldier. He was used as part of a secret troop of soldiers used for their German native language skills. He was on Normandy Beach 10 days after the first landing, and he wandered through Germany and France on the front lines, and he ended up with concussions, internal bleeding, eventually at the gates of Buchenwald. And this is what Cy saw. And even when he was on the front before that, he was beginning to plan the parade. This book shook him to, this experience shook him to the core and led him to begin working on that book after 6 months in a VA hospital. That photo is a metonym, let's say, for the camps, and it was something I used in the very first version of Mao's 3-page comic strip, where Buchenwald with a little arrow saying Papa to somebody in the second row was part of the event. These images, inspired by the woodcut novels, informed my work already back then. Cy, when he got to America in 1935, had a great first year, escaping Polish and German anti-Semitism, only to find in Central Park himself being beaten nearly to death by an anti-Semitic soldier in New York after he'd come out of the Metropolitan Museum, where he watched and talked to pictures and had them talk to each other. Here, the same scene where a cop in a rowboat heard his accent, asked for his papers, and beat him to an inch of his life, leading to a suicide attempt for him at the age of 16. When he got out of the war, he began making beautiful pictures. This is his revisiting of Central Park. These are the pictures galleries wanted from him, and it's what he needed to rebuild his life. He thought of these as luminous pictures of light coming in after the darkness. But the darkness returned, as you can see on the left hand of that painting, and led him back into making pictures of the traumas that he had lived through in the earlier years before the war and during, like the next one. As one of these pictures where he was making this out of collages, next one, collages that were made of earlier paintings. He had these paintings that were selling for lots of dough, as I think I explained, but here he was having pictures talk to each other even by cutting apart his old paintings that had been very successful and popular and getting those pieces to talk to each other from one picture in one picture, or here making new paint plus pieces of old pictures where an animal becomes a tree, where a face becomes a hand, and so on. That one that you just passed was something called Centipede. He wanted to make 100 feet of paintings, but he was kind of a serial pathological painter, a pathological serial, not killer, but painter, drawing about killing sometimes. But his centipede kept getting bigger. By here, in 1960 or so, he had to change it to a millipede. And by the time I met him, I made a very long millipede. There you go. He began to make triptychs, having pictures talk to each other that way. And he used to say, style I thought would choke me. As you can sense as we flash through these paintings, these were triptychs. The next one that you see is different periods of his life made into a stacked triptych, sometimes triptychs in every direction, next to each other, from back to forward, a triptych. And here is one way he made paintings that talk to each other. Here he is sitting in front of a painting that's about, I don't know, it's 15 feet high, I can't remember right now. But what you're looking at, look at the next one. This is made up of pieces of other paintings that he had made and new work on them. And when you look at them closely, you'll see Each one of them is about a 20-inch by 20-inch square, is a 20-inch by 20-inch square called Ecce Homo, about his life as a painter. This is a more cheerful one. I think of it as his psychedelic sexual side. It's called Rondo. It's about 40 or 50 paintings that go around a room and then repeat, just like a musical rondo would. Part of a long series he made called The Procession, in many different styles, because he said, style I felt would choke me, and now that he wasn't in a gallery, he wasn't beholden. These are suites of sometimes 5, 10, 3, 11 pictures that would be like some film that would get put together to the next part of the procession, and these became like about 800 pictures by the end. Nobody, including Sy, has ever seen them all put together.
And unfortunately, we're racing a little bit faster than we wanted to. This was a sequence that he did.
It's called The Trail, made in 1999. It looks very modern to me. These are meant to be contemplated, not light showed, but so be it.
And
they're about 40 inches by 40 inches. I asked Sy, so what's this about, The Trail? He says, well, I was thinking about Auschwitz, about the clothes and the person drifting off into space, and then the red flame at the end. And then he pauses and he says, a lot of people I showed them to, they think it's about sex, so it's a matter of interpretation. This is his studio inside his rest home, like a Soho artist studio. This is, we can go through this? Okay. I'm sorry, I'm talking as fast as I can. He had horrible rheumatoid arthritis. He started to complain about to me, like before it was, what keeps me going? Curiosity. I wanted to know what I'd paint the next day. And then he couldn't paint well anymore. The rheumatoid arthritis made it almost impossible for him to hold a brush. And he was painting about 14 hours a day in this rest home. And then finally, he had enough. He painted enough on his wall. He stretched his canvases himself. He took the buzzsaw and tried to cut the hand off. Wow. He was found the next morning. He was still alive. He was put back together. He'd kind of self-medicated. He cut all the nerve endings, so although he couldn't paint with his right hand anymore, he was able to survive this. When the doctors said, what's the matter with you, Sy? You act like you're crazy, and you're not. He said, no, and now I know how hard bone really is. I'll never do it again. So he got back to work as best he could. He didn't like the paintings he made with his left hand, but he said, I can become a sculptor. My right hand knows what it can do as a painter, so it's angry at the left hand, but I never sculpted. And then at a certain point he says, Art, you've got to come visit. I made an installation. Tell me what it is, Sy. You can see it on the floor there. You can see it close up from in his studio here. He used his left hand to make hands coming out of the ground. And if you remember that bit of the parade as it went whizzing by you, there are hands coming out of the ground, holding flags during the parade, some of them seeming like they're coming out of the ground buried from 50 years or more later. His last series was a series called Ghosts. These large paintings, 20 by 40 inches, were the ghosts of his life coming back to him, done mostly with charcoal, and it was what he was working on until he couldn't work anymore, sometimes on both sides of the canvas because he couldn't cut the canvas anymore with his right hand, so he painted on the back. So like a sorcerer's apprentice, a population of ghosts came into the world, and Sy died 10 years after, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go a little bit too fast. Sy died 10 days after seeing the first printed copy of the book. He was amazed by it, saying, this is like a new genre. I'm curious. I want to see both sides at once. And then because Charlie wasn't with me, I had a toast to him to his book. He was very moved by it. And I asked him to just tell Charlie what he thought about the book. So I have a couple of seconds of him responding on my iPhone.
Should hopefully play.
Okay. It's not working.
I'm sorry, that's not working.
Basically
okay.
Saying,
hold on.
Can you do it?
Yeah, I'm going to cut out of here and go to here.
Wow, we're going a little bit of overtime, and Bernie's going to be sitting on my lap in about 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
We waited for Bernie to get out of the race. He could wait for us.
Can you do this?
Here it is.
Okay, yes?
Charlie this is really quite something. I didn't expect it to be quite so calm and unusual and beautiful. It's what I always dreamt. Maybe someday it will come through. Now it has, and I'm grateful.
10 days later, he died. He was very frail this last time I saw him. But as his daughter said as well, he was waiting to see the book so he could die. Gave him permission.
I'm sorry we're running out of time and we didn't have time for questions, but Art is going to be doing signing, and if you want him to ask any questions while he's doing the signing, we'd be glad to. Thank you.
A mad scramble.